Hi, I'm Catherine O'Brien. Welcome to Stanford University. How can companies get the most out of the employees they already have without continually searching for new ones? Charles O'Reilly, a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, takes issue with the prevailing wisdom that in order to be successful, companies need to acquire top talent. In his talk, Hidden Value, How Great Companies Achieve Extraordinary Results with Ordinary People, O'Reilly argues that the source of sustained competitive advantage already exists within every organization. Let's listen as he outlines ways to motivate ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results.
Well, good morning. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. I want to tell you a little bit about the research that Jeff and I did and really begin by talking to you a little bit about the story behind the book, why the book was written. As Janet indicated, I came here in 1993, and I came here because Stanford and the Graduate School of Business had committed itself to what I thought was an important endeavor, and that is taking seriously people in organizations, to really look at how organizations take advantage of people, leverage people. If you talk to senior executives and you listen carefully to what they say, they invariably talk about human resource issues. They talk about bench strength, they talk about sort of developing people, they talk about lots of HR issues. And so what the Stanford initiative, our HR initiative, has really been doing for the last 7 years is trying to understand how successful companies really make best use of their people. And so that is the beginning of the book. Now, what we did in doing the research for the book is we have spent a lot of time talking to companies like those in this room and others, trying to understand how they really manage people. And in doing that, it turns out that we discovered something which I think is counterintuitive. And so part of my job this morning is to provoke you a little bit. So when you leave here, perhaps you'll think a little bit differently. And in that sense, I think there's a mystery in the book, and we'll talk a little bit about the mystery and solving this mystery. The final thing I would say about the book was that having spent many years now sort of interacting with executives and managers like yourselves, one of the things that I've discovered is that we don't learn typically, the way we write books is not necessarily how we learn. That is, when we give a lecture or write an article or write a book, give a presentation, what we invariably do is we kind of distill the material and then we have some bullet points and we kind of march through the bullet points, and that's very efficient. I mean, that's a nice way to transmit information. It's not a very good way of actually learning. And so when Jeff and I wrote the book, we decided that what we would do is we wouldn't write a bunch of bullet points with the 4 things that you have to do to be successful, but rather we would tell stories about companies that have really gotten extraordinary results with ordinary people. And in telling those stories, what we wanted to do was to provide enough detail, enough richness, that people who read the book could actually see for themselves how these companies are operating. And so that's really the background of the book. Now, the topic is a topic I think that most of us in this room are familiar with, this so-called war for talent that the McKinsey people have identified. And if you listen carefully to the McKinsey, or you read carefully the McKinsey study, I think most of us would nod our heads and say, yeah, this is an important issue. This is an issue that all our organizations face. And indeed, the evidence is quite clear. I mean, if you look at the demography of this country, it is clear that the sort of prime age working people are diminishing. There are lots of demographic trends that would suggest that this is true. But the question that Jeff and I raise in the book is this logic really correct? That is, the war for talent would suggest that we have to go out and attract the very best people, and that we should spend an immense amount of effort identifying the top 10%, and we should do everything we can to attract them to our organizations. But we really wondered, as we looked at some of these companies, is this really the case? That is, do organizations succeed because they get the top 10%, or do they succeed because they are getting the best out of all their people? And I think that what we really find is that the answer is not so much that these organizations succeed because they get the very best people, but because they get the very best out of their people. And so I think this war for talent perhaps may direct our attention in not a very productive way. And so the book really is about how organizations do this. And here's what I would like to do this morning. I'd like to take about 45 minutes, and I want to provoke you a little bit and describe some of the things that we found. And I also want to talk a little bit about kind of why our conventional thinking about this topic may in fact not be helpful. And so in order to do that, I need to teach 2 MBA courses in 10 minutes. Okay? Now, for those of you who have MBAs, this is bad news, because I'm going to do in 10 minutes what you took almost a year to do. And the dirty little secret is it can be done in 10 minutes. And we just kind of fill up the time. Based on that, I want to try to convince you that some of the kind of conventional thinking about this topic is probably not helpful. And I'll give you a little evidence for that. Then what I want to do is I want to consider an alternative perspective, what we refer to as uncommon common sense. That is, I want to talk about a different way of thinking about getting the best out of people in organizations. And talk to you about some companies. And I want to just sort of briefly describe a set of companies, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you're not, and how they operate. And show you how common conventional wisdom is probably not very helpful. And this notion of uncommon common sense, if it's done well, can be extraordinarily powerful. And then we'll finish by talking about, well, if this is true, then why don't all managers do this? Okay, so that's what I want to do. So first, let's take 10 minutes and let's teach both the strategy course in the MBA program and the management course. Okay, 10 minutes. I think what most business schools are about, at least in part, is really helping students think about where does sustainable competitive advantage come from. I mean, that's what most organizations are looking for, right? That's what your organizations are looking for. How can we do something that adds value to the customer that our competitors can't easily imitate? That is, if the competitors can imitate it, then there's no sustained competitive advantage. And you do it, but then your competitors just simply follow along. This is at the heart of the strategy course. And indeed, when we teach strategy in the business school, the logic that we use, which seems to make perfect sense, and this should, for those of you who've been through this type of course, this should sound very familiar. The logic is really quite straightforward. The first issue is you have to answer 2 questions. These are the big strategy questions. The first question is, what business are we in? Okay, that's the kind of corporate strategy question. Second question is, given we're in a particular business, how are we going to compete? That is, why should any customer prefer our product or service to somebody else? And in the space of about 10 weeks, then what we do is we go through a set of analytics, a set of tools for how to think about that, how to think about functional strategies, marketing, finance, human resources. And we kind of finish with this notion that if you can identify the 3 or 4 things that you have to do to execute your strategy, and then align the organization around that, you'll be successful. And by the way, the role of senior management in this process is to kind of set the strategy and to make sure that the alignment is operating. Does that sound familiar to you? It should. This is Michael Porter. This is all the kind of big strategy people. Now, it kind of makes sense. But let's look a little more closely at what this really means. And let's ask, is this conventional wisdom right? And our own answer is, we think it's not entirely right. That is, conventional wisdom would say, look, if you want to get competitive advantage, you need to be in the right industry. This is what the 5 forces framework is about. This is what Michael Porter talks about. Or you need to have economies of scale. If you can get big enough, you can get your costs low enough, and that gives you a competitive advantage. Or, by the way, you need to be, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, you've got to be in high tech. Or you have to be lean. We went through a phase, of course, about 7 or 8 years ago where all the emphasis, the management fads were around Six Sigma, being lean, that sort of thing. Or, by the way, more recently, you have to win the war for talent. And let's look at each of these, because when you start to look closely, what you see is what sounds right isn't necessarily true. So if you look, for instance, about whether being in one industry versus another matters, what you see is industry don't seem to matter a lot. That is, in any industry, there will be successful firms that can make a lot of money, and there'll be firms that aren't successful. So it turns out that industry by itself, even though we think it matters, is not that important. Well, how about size? Well, there's no evidence, by the way, that size by itself adds value. So simply being large is no guarantee that you're going to be successful. Well, what about being in high tech? Well, you know, it's interesting. If you look at the lists of fast-growing companies, this happens to be from last year's Business Week, what you see is the fastest-growing companies are not often in high tech, but they're in, advanced industries like ready-mix concrete and things like that. So the evidence about being in high tech isn't particularly compelling either. Well, how about the evidence for being lean? Well, there's now been sufficient research that we know a fair bit about the effects of downsizing, and it turns out that the effects of downsizing are very short-term. There are no real long-term advantages to downsizing. Well, how about the war for talent? I mean, surely in the year 2000, 2001, winning the war for talent ought to be a source of sustainable competitive advantage. Well, it turns out if you read the McKinsey study carefully, what they're really talking about is not so much winning the war for talent, but creating organizations in which talent of whatever sort can flourish. So what do we conclude? Well, one of the things that Jeff and I conclude, having read this literature fairly closely, is that it's not so much about getting the very best people. Because if you create great organizations, you'll attract great people. But the idea that you have to go out and sort of just find the very best people, we think is misdirected. Not only that, if you really take seriously the notion of sustainable competitive advantage, where sustainable competitive advantage really comes from is not from strategy, but from execution. I mean, think about it. Dick Kovacevic is a Stanford grad. Dick Kovacevic, you may know, runs Wells Fargo Bank. When he was running Norwest Bank several years ago, this is in the midst of a huge consolidation in retail finance in the United States, where banks were closing branches and laying people off and squeezing costs out. Kovacevic was very successful with Norwest Bank, and he was successful with a strategy that said, we're going to keep our branch banks open. As all our competitors close, we're going to keep ours open. Now, that only works if you can sell more through each branch bank. And that's an issue of execution, and he says it, I think, rather well. It doesn't matter what your strategy is in the sense if you can't execute it, there's no competitive advantage. So in that sense, competitive advantage and sustainable competitive advantage, as you'll see with some of the companies we looked at, really comes from having a strategy that is correct, but more importantly, executing that strategy. Not only that, if you have the wrong strategy and you execute it brilliantly, you'll fail faster, right? But in today's environment, that's what you want to do, right? Okay. The other conclusion that we came to is that simply knowing what you need to do is not the answer. And my friend and colleagues, Bob Sutton and Jeff Effer, have written a book called The Knowing-Doing Gap, where they talk about this. I've spent the last 4 years working with senior managers at the World Bank. Jim Wolfenson is the president of the World Bank. Wolfenson came in about 4.5 years ago, and he looked into the future, and he said, we have to transform the bank. The bank had, for 50 years, had been a huge success lending to lesser developed countries, and it had become inward-looking and bureaucratic, analytic, an organization of 10,000 people, 6,000 of whom are economists. I mean, it was a success, but there was lots of criticism about the bank. And Wolfenson identified the big barrier to changing the bank as the culture of the organization. It's now 4 years later, and I'm here to tell you they are failing abysmally at transforming the bank, even though they know exactly what they have to do. So not only is it about execution, simply knowing what you have to do is not sufficient. All right, so that's the strategy course. The issue is you have to have a strategy which provides value to the customer, but more importantly, you have to execute it. The second course is the management course, and here's the management course. And permit me to be just a little bit academic about this. Once you've decided on what your strategy is, then we spend a lot of and by the way, what your key success factors are. So how do I add value to the customer? What are the 3 or 4 things that I have to do? Now what I have to do, and we take 10 weeks to do this, is to ask 3 diagnostic questions. Do I have the right people? That is, do the people have the skills to execute the key success factors? And we spend 3 weeks talking about esoteric theories of motivation. But fundamentally, the basic question is, do you have the right people? And do they have the right skills? And can you motivate them? The next 3 or 4 weeks are spent asking the question, am I organized the right way? Am I measuring the right things? Am I rewarding the right things? Am I structured in a way that people can get the right information to execute the critical tasks? Okay? The last part of the course is spent around culture, and do we have the right culture? Now, we spend 10 weeks doing this. In doing that, here is what we typically talk about. We typically talk about, and I think this should sound familiar to many of your organizations, a sort of conventional wisdom about how to manage people in organizations today. Things like career resilience, employability. That is, it's the responsibility of all of the individuals in the organizations to take responsibility for their own career. When we welcome people to organizations, we have them sign an at-will document that says that they can be fired for any reason at any time. Right? We select people for their skills, not necessarily for their attitudes. Right? It's very important that we get the right skills. We focus on short-term performance. We do a whole set of things, which, by the way, I think signal exactly the wrong thing. I mean, my colleague Jeff Pfeffer poses the following. He said, imagine you go into a bar and you see somebody that you find very attractive. And you walk over to them and you use the following pickup line. You said, I think you're beautiful, you're wonderful. Please come with me, stay with me forever, until the first time that I find that you're no longer attractive, and then you're out of there. This is not likely to be a very successful way of establishing a relationship, right? And yet, think about what the values are that characterize most organizations. I mean, people in organizations don't like to talk about values, but of course organizations have values. And here are the values of a typical organization, 21st century organization. Well, as an individual, what does this mean to me? This means that I ought to look out for my own interests. I ought to sort of not worry about the organization. And indeed, if you think about what the assumptions are that most managers make, or most organizations make, about people in organizations, here are the assumptions. And this ought to sound very familiar to you from your economics courses. We assume, first of all, it's kind of a Newtonian assumption of motivation, that people will remain at rest unless you apply a force, right? Second of all, we assume, at least economic theory assumes, that workers and management, or employees and management, have different interests, and they are not aligned. And therefore, the encouragement is we should spend a lot of time designing these optimal control systems to align employee interests. Not only that, we assume that people are, in the words of transaction theory and economic theory, that people are opportunistic. They are self-interest seeking with guile. That's a nice way of saying they lie, right? We worry a lot about designing control systems to take care of this. So this is this is the kind of thinking that characterizes, implicitly, by the way, I'm not saying that we go around doing this explicitly, but this is the kind of thinking that really characterizes much of what goes on when we design organizations. It is a model which is rooted in economic theory, and really, frankly, I think does not capture the way most of us would like to be treated. The fact is, most of us understand that the reason people leave jobs, the reason you have left jobs in the past, is probably not just for the money, but because you weren't appreciated, your boss wasn't very good, you weren't getting the challenge, people weren't taking your interest into account. So the fatal flaw, I think, with this approach is the following. The whole edifice is built on a set of assumptions which I think if we think about for a little bit, our own intuition would tell us this is probably not right. It is right in terms of the theory, but it is not right in terms of the practice. Okay. That completes the conventional approach. And I now want to think about, well, what about the alternative? Is there another way to do this? And of course, there is another way. You know, most organizations today, especially in today's labor market, have some version of this hot air. You know, people are our most important product. So they're, you know, I think it's printed in the CEO's letter to the shareholders. You know, it's automatically printed where there's a sentence or two about how important our people are, right? But the question is there evidence that this might in fact be true? And it turns out there is remarkable evidence that this is true. And what is so remarkable about this is that we don't seem to pay attention to it. We just completed a study looking at startup companies here in the Valley and what predicted their success at going public. Companies that were based on kind of people-centric practices and values were 12 times more likely to go public than firms that weren't. The evidence coming out now of 15 years of study of the automobile industry, steel, apparel, you know, lots of different industries is remarkable. It's powerful. And yet, what we see is, you know, again and again, even in spite of this evidence, organizations are not run this way. And that's a mystery. Why should that be? Because our presumption is that, you know, people who run organizations are smart people. They go to great schools. So why is this? So that's by way of background. That's kind of why we wrote the book. And there are really three mysteries that we needed to solve. The first mystery is this notion of, given this evidence, why is it that organizations don't capitalize on it? Why is it that the inclination is to design organizations that are sort of top-down and controlling? The second mystery is, how is it that some companies have done this? And indeed, we talk in the book about a number of companies, and I'll describe them to you here. Kind of why is it that firms like Southwest Airlines and AES and New United Motors and some of these other organizations, how do they do this? And that's a mystery, and we need to think about that. But the third mystery is the biggest mystery of all, and that is, if it's so clear, that is, if there are these advantages, why aren't companies doing it? So that's what we I now want to describe for you. And the way we thought about this was the following. You know, we see lots of our terrific MBAs go out into organizations every year, and our MBAs are truly extraordinary people. And they go off into these organizations, and oftentimes the organizations are quite ordinary in terms of their performance. That is, they hire extraordinary people, and somehow or another they get just ordinary performance. The companies that we looked at here, we think are, in some sense, the mirror image. That is, companies operating, as you'll see, in some industries that strategic analysis would tell us these are bad industries to be in, hiring quite ordinary people with absolutely extraordinary performance. And the companies we looked at are the following. We looked at AES, a big power company. Anybody know AES? It's a remarkable company. Operates power plants. Now, when I say power generation, what words come to mind? Kind of regulated, old, top down. And yet, AES operates in, now 18 countries around the world. They have a headquarters staff of 35 people, 23 of whom do consolidated financial reports. That is, they have virtually no corporate staff, no human resource staff. They have no lawyers. Big surprise. And we'll go through some of these. And the interesting thing is that, you see, I think in your organizations, if you were honest with yourself, what you would say is, look, we've got lots of ordinary people. And the real test, the real success in the future is the degree to which we can take all the people in our organization and unleash the talent in them, not if we can go out and get a bunch of all-stars. Okay? Now, this approach is a little different. The approach is the following. These organizations start with some fundamental values. Then, based on those values, they design a set of management practices that are consistent with those values. So they don't start with strategy. They literally start with a set of values and a set of management practices. These practices and values then allow them to do things that their competition can't do. That is, they develop some capabilities to do some things that add value to the customer that their competition can't do. Then they come up with a strategy. So these are, in our words, value-based organizations. Let me illustrate. Think about an industry we all have too much experience with, the airline industry. Okay? You read the paper this morning or yesterday, and what you see are United and American consolidating, getting bigger and bigger. The conventional and sort of wisdom in the industry is we have to have a hub and spoke system. I mean, one writer once said, a hub and spoke system is a great way to get large numbers of unhappy customers together in the same place at the same time. I mean, if you think about it, the hub and spoke system help the airlines. They don't help you and me. We just want to go from A to B, right? They also say in the industry that, by the way, we have to minimize labor costs and unions are the enemy. Now, with that conventional wisdom, think about our friends at Southwest. Southwest is an absolutely remarkable company. Southwest has grown and been profitable every year for the last 28 years. They have won the Triple Crown, the award for best on-time performance, fewer customer complaints, and fewer lost baggage 5 years in a row. And how do they do that? When we went to Southwest and we spent time at Southwest, here's what they do. First of all, they emphasize a set of values: family, teamwork. They don't emphasize profit. They emphasize hard work. And they are clear about selecting people based on attitudes, based on fit. That is, Herb Kelleher, the CEO, says we draft great attitudes. We're not worried about skills. Now, this, of course, does not mean that when they hire pilots that they don't hire competent pilots. They do. But given that you can hire from a set of pilots, you might as well hire pilots that fit into your culture, right? They then do things like invest heavily in training. Senior management spends one day a quarter working in a frontline job, loading bags or taking reservations, and this is not out drinking coffee with the people. This is actually doing the work. Why would they do that? I mean, the cost accountants would tell us this is a terrible waste of senior management time. Well, of course, you know why they do it, because it signals to people that says, look, you're doing something important. And by the way, if you think about it, what will make for an unpleasant experience in an airline can be caused as much by a reservation agent as it can by somebody who loses your bag as it can be by a pilot, right? So this organization, and it's very successful, succeeds because they emphasize a set of values and a culture. Think about, as we started to talk a minute ago, think about the power industry. Power industry is, you know, the conventional wisdom would tell you this is a miserable industry to be in, right? Emphasize, you know, regulation and control. Spend a lot of time worrying about, since it's capital intensive, worry a lot about getting the finances right, worry a lot about specialization. Well, here's our friends at AES. Dennis Bakke, who's the CEO, is very clear. He says, you know, he said, profits are to business like breathing is to life. You have to breathe, but you don't live to breathe. And in his view, this organization is not about just making profit. It's about sort of stewarding resources. This is an organization that is founded on 4 values: fun, fairness, integrity, and social responsibility. When Wall Street analysts see this, they choke, right? But in fact, if you were to log on to the AES website and look at what their stock price is, you would see an absolutely remarkable performance. It's an organization where it is entirely team-based. They share all information with people. That is, for SEC purposes, for reporting purposes, all employees are insiders. Why shouldn't you do that? You know, when we talk to our MBAs and we say, you know, you ought to share information with people, you know, they're like, well, you know, why would you share information with people? But think about what the assumption is. The assumption is somehow or another, if you share information with people, either they'll misuse it or they're too stupid to know what to do with it, which is exactly wrong, right? So this organization and the others we study share information widely. By the way, they have no experts. Every time they go off to buy a new power plant, they have no finance staff, they have no business development function. The people themselves do it. Now, people, when you say that, they get a little upset about that, because after all, we spend a lot of time learning how to do finance and to do all these things. But the fact is, if people are sharing a lot of information, nobody's going to do a stupid thing, nobody's going to do a dumb thing, and they share lots of information with each other, and so they make the right decisions. So this is an organization that is fast and efficient. If you look at their operating efficiencies, they are just more efficient than all their competitors. Why? Because they've unleashed the talent in the organization. That's the power generation industry. Think about an industry that's near and dear to our own heart, high tech, or in this case, software. If you think about how we, in the Valley at least, think about what it takes to manage in the software industry, I think what we would say is, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to load up the B-52s with stock options and fly over your workforce and just kind of carpet bomb them with stock options, right? You know, that's for openers. Okay. Then what you have to do is design these incentive systems that are very finely tuned. Think about our friends at SAS. People know the SAS Institute? Here's the SAS Institute, for those of you who don't know it. Over $1 billion, largest privately held software company in the United States. Okay? In an era when turnover is rife, their turnover is less than 3%. They operate out of Cary, North Carolina, founded by a fellow named Jim Goodnight, who, by the way, when he founded the firm, had worked previously for another large public company. And he founded this firm based on the fact that he never, ever wanted to work in an organization that was like the one that he'd come from. Here's what the SAS Institute does. First of all, they use no stock options whatsoever. They use modest bonuses. They have free on-site health care. No waiting, by the way. They have subsidized child care. It is remarkable. Now, when you talk to most conventional organizations, and they look at something like this, they say, well, this is nuts. And Dave Russo, who is the head of human resources, says, wait a minute, think about it. Think about how much your turnover costs you when you talk about subsidized health care. And he runs a little calculation where if you look at the typical turnover rate, you multiply that by, annual salary or 1.5 annual salary, and you look at how much that costs a company the size of SAS, and you compare it to what they're paying for all these benefits, it financially makes perfect sense. Although the logic is, I think, quite different. It is an organization that has no product development strategy. Basically, what they do is they let people, in their words, dig holes. They try different things. And they have grown phenomenally. So the conventional wisdom says do it this way, and what we see is with the SAS Institute, a company that's just completely different and extraordinarily successful. Well, let me give you a last example. Think about the retail industry. This, I think, conventional wisdom would tell you is a terrible industry, right? It's low margin typically. The result is that people in this industry pay low wages. They don't invest in people because turnover is high. They spend a lot of money worrying about security, so to minimize shrink or theft. They use lots of part-timers because you don't have to pay benefits for part-timers. And then you look at a company like the Men's Wearhouse that we're all familiar with from George's ads, I guarantee it kind of thing. The Men's Wearhouse has been growing like crazy in an industry where the only way you grow is you take market share away from somebody else. And how have they been doing that? Well, for those of you who've seen George, you know that George is an ex-hippie. I mean, he's a refugee from the 60s. And he has a set of values about what it takes to be successful in business, and he operates according to those values. For instance, last year, George fired his top grossing salesman in the entire company. He fired him. He fired him because it turns out that this fellow was stealing sales from other people. They monitor that very carefully. They make sure that people don't steal sales from other people. And guess what? After he fired this top grossing salesman, what happened to the sales in the store? They went up, right? Why? Because people in the store felt better. Because they understood that this person, that by the way was a star, was in the top 10%, was really, in fact, causing the rest of the people to feel crummy about their jobs. So George, runs a store, a chain, where he's got almost no part-timers. And by the way, people feel terrific. And by the way, they sell. Any of you shop at the Men's Wearhouse? Yeah, I mean, you should actually, I should give you an assignment. You should go shopping at the Men's Wearhouse and see. I mean, think about what's happened here. Here you have a set of companies, and we could talk about New United Motors, or we could talk about Cisco, we could talk about PSS World Medical. These are all companies that start with a revolutionary but kind of commonsensical set of values that, by the way, people can be trusted, that people do want to contribute. Now, does this mean that you don't have people who will violate this? Of course you do, and all these companies understand that. But the real question is, are you going to design your organization with control systems that effectively handicap 98% so you can catch the 2%? What these organizations do typically is they turn it on their head. They say, fine, we're going to design an organization that's going to fit the 98%. And we understand that there will be some people who violate it. But by the way, if you look at how they manage themselves, these organizations in many respects are self-correcting. They begin with a sense of what are our values, what is our culture. And profit is typically not in that list, which doesn't, of course, mean that they're not interested in profit. But that is not what gets your people emotionally engaged. Then they make sure that they hire very carefully for fit. That is, they select people who want to be in this organization, who will accept these values. Then they typically organize people in teams, and here's part of the magic. If you go to a company like New United Motors, or if you go to PSS World Medical or AES, if you find yourself in that organization and you don't fit, what happens? Your team members will first of all try to help you. And if you can't be helped, your team members will in fact get rid of you. And by the way, they emphasize that clearly money is important, but money is a terrible motivator, typically, because it's too important to most of us. And therefore, these organizations emphasize sort of non-monetary rewards. In fact, it's interesting when you look at, when you talk to many managers, as we did, around kind of, you know, how do you create a sense of ownership in your organization? There is a kind of there's a mistake, I think, that many managers make, many of us make, and that is the following. When we think about ownership, we make the following equation. We say financial ownership, stock options, equals psychological ownership. And that is not true. I had John Reed, who is the CEO, or was the CEO of Citigroup, come to a class, speak to one of our classes a couple of years ago, and he stood up in front of our MBAs and announced that he had just wasted $350 million of the Citicorp shareholders' money. And he went on to describe how 3 years earlier, in an attempt to create an environment of teamwork among his senior managers, he took his top 100 managers off-site and he gave each of them $1 million in stock options. He thought that if he gave them a big enough reward, that they would begin to behave as team members. He said 3 years later, bull market, that $100 million in stock options paid off at $350 million. He said it didn't change a single behavior. In fact, it created a two-class system. There were the millionaires and the non-millionaires. He said, in retrospect, if I'd wanted teamwork, I shouldn't have used money. He said, I should have been clear what I meant by teamwork. I should have held up people who were exemplars of this, and I should have made clear to people I was not going to tolerate a lack of teamwork. So here's the difference. If you think about psychological ownership and where psychological ownership comes from, it comes from being involved. It comes from being listened to. It comes from having an opportunity to participate. And the organizations we look at invariably have psychological ownership. And they do that through their management practices. And it's that psychological ownership that we think really does sort of capture the advantage of people. So, these organizations, we think, place lots of emphasis on people and creating an environment in which people's talents can be used. It is not that strategy is unimportant. Clearly, strategy is important. But they live according to their values. And those values and the practices create a set of capabilities which then the organization can use to do things that their competitors can't. That's the Men's Warehouse story. That's the New United Motors. That, by the way, is the Southwest Airlines story, right? I mean, think about Southwest. Why is it that firms like US Air with their Metrojet or United with their shuttle have been unable to replicate Southwest? It is pretty straightforward. It's because it takes alignment and consistency. And it takes a leader's role which is different than the typical imperial CEO. The leaders in these organizations are really about adhering to the values and managing the culture. They are not about sitting in some mahogany office and telling people what to do. So that's what we found. Now, many of you, I suspect at this point, are saying the following. Yeah, but what about IBM? What about Levi Strauss? Well, we take that concern seriously because there is always a danger when you simply talk about successful companies. And in the book, we actually go through kind of why it is that some of these other companies, and indeed one of the companies in the book that we look at, is not a success story. And we sort of challenge the reader in the book to say, okay, if you think you understand what's going on, why is this company not so successful? Because they do a lot of the same things. Okay. So here's our conclusions. We come to two conclusions from the book, and then I'm going to stop and entertain any questions. The first conclusion is that, you know what? there is sustainable competitive advantage from people. The problem is that it is not easy to do. It requires managers to behave in ways that we are typically not used to behaving. But there is competitive advantage. And I mean serious competitive advantage, where you're taking market share away from your competitors, where you're sort of being successful over long periods of time. The second conclusion we come to is that you probably can't benchmark your way to success. If your vision of strategy is we're going to implement best practice, the very best I think you can hope to be is as good as the rest. What these organizations are doing are sort of thinking outside the box. They're being non-conventional. And they're adopting a set of practices, by the way, that I think help them do that. So here's the final question that I would leave you with. You're going to hear a lot more about the war for talent. There's a book coming out which I have no doubt will be quite popular. I want you to think about whether you're winning the war for talent in your organizations. And one way to do that is to ask yourself the following question. If you were to get a focus group of your employees together and you were to ask them why they are there, what is it that gets them out of bed in the morning? If the answer comes back, stock options and money, you're probably not winning the war for talent. Thanks very much. The question is, does culture change have to come from the top? And in our experience, the answer is yes. And the reason is that senior managers, I mean, the question that we all ask in organizations, it doesn't matter where we are in them, we always look up and we always ask, you know, we watch senior management, we ask, you know, what are they saying, what are they doing, and what's really important? And it's very difficult to change a culture if you've got senior managers that are behaving inconsistently. The reason, in my view, the reason the World Bank is failing at their culture change effort, they have put their top 500 managers through a 6-week executive program run by Stanford, Harvard, and INSEAD. There are only 37 people who have not, in the senior management, who have not gone through that program. Jim Wolfenson, the 6 managing directors, and the 25 vice presidents. Right? So why isn't the culture changing? Because they look up and they see these people behaving inconsistently. So that's why we think. Which doesn't mean, by the way, that managers lower in the organization can't create their own cultures. But I think if you're going to transform an organization, it simply has to be from the top. The question is, in a team-based company, what's the role of competition, sort of that sort of thing? Equity is important to all of us. And so the first question is, do people see the rewards as somehow being kind of justified? The question, a slightly deeper version of that is kind of how do you design systems that'll do that, and we could talk about that. Let me suggest to you that you think about our friends at Whole Food Markets. Whole Food Markets could have been on this list. Whole Foods, as Southwest, as lots of these companies, shares lots of information with people, and they compete not so much against other teams, but they compete against their past performance, they compete against the competition. So I think competition is fine, but not if it's within the same unit. And indeed, the reward systems in these organizations are typically based on the unit's performance, not on the individual. So if you go to Whole Foods, your rewards are not based on whether you're in the cheese department, but it's on how well the Palo Alto store does against the Austin store. So I think it's a very important issue, and it's a tricky one to get these systems aligned, which is one reason why companies don't imitate them, because it takes an immense amount of care to align these things. The question is, does Stanford University practice these? The answer is no. Okay. Now we could have a question. Now we could have a discussion about why. It seems to me that the issue is, the first issue is, can we involve a set of people and ask them what they want? We are just doing a study now on a company called JetBlue, which is a startup airline operating out of JFK. One of the things that they did in designing it's a team-based organization, they went out and they talked to flight attendants. And they asked them, listen, what do you want by way of rewards? Instead of making HR's life easy by simply saying, all right, here's what you're going to get. They went out and they asked flight attendants, and guess what they found? They found there were some flight attendants who see the job of flight attendant as a short-term job, and therefore they pay them an extra $500 a month. They get to live in New York. This is for people who are just graduating from college. They have another group of flight attendants, by the way, where they have job sharing. They literally have mother-daughter teams as flight attendants. People who want that sort of balance. And then they have other flight attendants, other groups of flight attendants, who want something else. So the point is, I think that my response would be, do we really know what people want? And by the way, can we be responsive? Can we say yes to these people? The question is, can organizations transform themselves? There are lots of organizations that have made successful transformations. New United Motors went from the worst plant in the General Motors system to probably the best by by lots of metrics. So I think you can transform organizations. Gordon Bethune transformed Continental Airlines to this. So I think it can be done. It's clearly harder. Okay. Well, you all have to go to work, so thank you very much.